Here we go. Okay, welcome back once again. And this will be our lecture number 3, yes, on the course in bioethics within the program of cellular and molecular biology at St. Thomas University. Always like to begin with a little prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love. Amen. All right. A little bit of philosophy, and I tell you, the summaries not only help you, but help me also, because I see when a lot of the students kind of miss the same point or not clear, then it means that I didn't teach it well. And I have to go over a few terms here that are more on the philosophical side, because I'm finding that over the years and the decades, people are forgetting their philosophy, or maybe they never actually had philosophy as such, and mostly had maybe a course in logic or something like that. And so I need to review some philosophical concepts that appeal to reason, all right? An abstract thought, you know that abstract thought is the highest power of the human mind. It occurs on the cortex, on the gray matter, and it also uses a lot of ATPs. Somewhere I read along the line that it uses about 2/3 more ATPs than physical exercise, mental exercise. And that's why after some time of thinking and reflecting, especially abstract thought like would be mathematics or even just reading technical language, one feels tired. Okay, you notice how after reading for a while or doing math, the eyes tend to close, the eyelids tend to close, we feel tired. That's because we're actually using more ATPs. We're getting tired. We're actually getting tired, all right? Because the brain uses a disproportionate amount of energy compared to the rest of the body. And that's also why blood flow is very high on the brain, and so many capillaries, because it needs a lot of oxygen to do the cellular respiration, right, for recharging the ATPs. And that's why bleeding on the head is pretty intense sometimes, because there's a lot of capillaries. Anyway, why that? Oh yeah, so why don't we lose weight? Some people ask the students, why don't I lose weight when I study, Professor? Because you're burning the active glucose in the circulatory system. You're not getting into the glycogen, that is the fat inside the tissue, all right? For that one, you need the physical exercise to move the glycogen out into the circulatory system and then burn it. All right. At any rate, these are some concepts, and because we have to navigate back and forth here between science, philosophy, and theology, empirical science, I mean, typically natural science or medical science, then sometimes, like I was saying, the terms are not univocal, and sometimes that can be confusing because some of the terms, some of the words have very technical meaning in one field or the other. And in particular for this one, in philosophy and theology, matter and substance, but especially in philosophy, matter and substance or form. And I should have put this the other way around, doesn't matter, doesn't matter. Okay, so matter and form, really in empirical sciences, they mean kind of the same. For example, there's a whole course, it's a whole field of morphology, right? What does morphology study? It studies the shape of things, the structures, muscle, etc. And so, or skeletons, but really, that form, right, in empirical sciences, scientists mean shape. So it should be really shapeology, not morphology, because form has a different meaning. In philosophy, at least, form is not the same as shape or matter. Form is more the substance of the thing, all right? So for example, there is chair and there is chairness. And I think that after a while of being alive, we all recognize what is a chair as opposed to a table or a tree or a sky. Typically associated with nouns grammatically. But there are many different types of chairs, right? Many different shapes of chairs. including the material from which they're made and so on and so forth, and shapes. But there's one form of chair, normal chair, which is for sitting. And that whole dictum in science or in biology, nature, that form follows function. Well, they actually mean shape follows function. The structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing. So I need to rescue that philosophical meaning of form because it's important. Really, another way of saying form, it could be the substance. So there will be one form of chair and many different types of chairs, many different shapes of chair, okay? And typically, grammatically, it coincides with the noun, the common noun, right? So again, going back to nouns, to grammar, there's a common noun of table and there's a proper noun of, for example, our names, our individual names, okay? That's a proper noun. And typically they're distinguished because the proper noun is capitalized. At any rate, common nouns is grammatically what is the form or the substance of things, the substance. And in fact, a more technical way of calling the noun in grammar is a substantive. Maybe you remember from high school or grammar school the word substantive. In Espanol, el sustantivo, right? That is the noun grammatically. And then the adjective, what does the adjective do? It qualifies the noun. So the table may be plastic or metal or green or light or heavy, okay? But tableness is the substance of what we're talking about. With regards to human then, or actually to biology, typically the substance would be the species. And so it's defined genetically by the genome. And then the expression of that genome, okay? But typically the genome, and also it would be like the, I usually tend to use the classical or what is known as the biological definition of species, introduced by Ernst Mayr over 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, right? With the synthesis, with the modern synthesis, remember, with it, between evolution and genetics coming together. And Mayr gives us that biological definition of species, which is the individuals that can interbreed, first premise, and the second premise, producing fertile hybrids, fertile offsprings, not hybrids, fertile offspring, all right? So that precisely a hybrid, which is individuals from two different species, related but different species, may actually interbreed, but typically the offspring is not feral. And the classical example is the mule, which I understand is a interbreed between a donkey and a horse. I don't know which male and female, but the point is that the mule, the resultant mule, typically they're sterile. And so it's kind of a dead end. And those are hybrids, in contrast to the offspring, which in principle, they're supposed to be fertile, but of course, we have to wait until reproductive success, until reproductive adulthood, which again, biologically, adulthood is defined as capable of reproducing, all right? So those are the definitions that I'm using from standard biology. And then finally, hylomorphism, because I think that you would all benefit a little bit if you read about hylomorphism, which is this philosophical stance that maintains the substantial unity between body and soul in the human, okay? So the substantial unity between body and soul is known as hylomorphism. It would be in contrast with a dual or a dualistic vision of the human person, whereby we have a body and we may or may not have a soul that's poured into that body, all right? And so hylomorphism, look it up. Sometimes it's written with an E, hylomorphism, either way. And look it up and read up a little bit. It goes back to pre-Christian, actually, to classical Greece, where we get, you know, that classical Greece is pretty much the birthplace of Western civilization, of culture, of the culture, all right? The agricultural birthplace occurred several thousand years before that in Mesopotamia. The confluation between those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are still there today, highly channeled and with locks and stuff. But anyway, that's the region of today's Iran and Iraq, more or less, in that region, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. is considered to be where early humans more or less made a transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture. And so able to settle down, at least for periods of time, enough to actually develop a culture, right? Especially written language and other, what is known as material culture, meaning things, stuff, pottery, etc., even art, whatnot. All right, so just a little bit of a review of the philosophy there and some key terms. All right, forward. Again, if there are questions or comments, just jump in. All right, so today I want to dedicate the lecture mostly to contraception and what is known as non-therapeutic sterilization. In other words, sterilization for the purpose of contraception, not for the purpose of therapy, of healing, as would be, for example, a cancerous ovary or cancerous uterus. Obviously, removing that cancer, that tumor, is going to render the person sterile or infertile, but that's therapeutic, all right? Different from the contraceptive purpose of a sterilization like vasectomy or tubal ligation. All right. And then Friday, God willing, we'll look at in vitro fertilization, which is kind of the flip side of contraception. And also that gives you time, if you have not done so yet, to read that little article I wrote a few years back. It's posted on IVF, or assisted procreation. All right, so look it up in the Canvas page for assisted procreation. It's a little PDF article that I wrote a few years back. It's a good prep for Friday's lecture. All right, so I'm going to go a little back and forth here. First, I'm going to give you a little brief, very brief history of the pill in the United States, because it's the largest, is the most popular contraceptive use, not only in the US, but throughout the world. Then I'm gonna go kind of backtrack for a moment and talk about human sexual intercourse as human, okay? And then come back to contraception, or the bioethical analysis of contraception. So very briefly, goes back to one main person in the United States, Margaret Sanger. Okay, now Margaret Sanger was born of Irish parents. They were immigrants, and she was toward the end of the 1800s, and she was the sixth of 11 children, 11 siblings, so she was kind of in the middle, but her mother actually had, from her accounts, 18 pregnancies, so she lost them up, lost 7 babies, 7 pregnancies naturally, okay? The point here is that her mom was typically pregnant most of her reproductive years from early on. So Margaret became a nurse around the age of 20, and what I don't have here is a little bit more about her childhood background. The mother was sickly, and the father was working a lot, but not caring much for the family. And it was a very typical, kind of stereotypical mentality that the mother took care of the children and the father went out to work. And then when he came back from work, the wife had to be available for him, and that was not discussed or challenged. The bottom line is that she had to end up taking care of at least her younger siblings, because the mother was sickly, and I think at some point she actually lost her mom. And so she had to take care of her siblings. It was a lot of struggle, and what you can remember from reading her biography a little bit, a lot as a child and as a teenager, her mom was always pregnant and always cooking and working and washing clothes and dirty diapers, and it was a big, big struggle for this woman. And she just felt, Margaret felt that women were enslaved mostly because of pregnancy, okay? And so if the woman could have absolute control, full control of her reproduction, then she would have more freedom and she would be more up to par a little bit to the man who never gets pregnant, okay? But always wants the intercourse. So she felt that definitely the burden was a lot on the woman, and therefore, in her mindset, it had to do with not being able to regulate her cycle. So she becomes a nurse also to help women and to help people in general. She was also a suffragist. Remember, suffragist was the movement of women to get the vote here in the United States because they didn't have the right to vote, all right? But unfortunately, she was also influenced by the eugenics movement that was going on in Europe a little before her at the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s. That eugenic movement that started in Europe and spilled over here in the 20s and 30s, just to mention one name, Adolf Hitler, actually led the world to a world war to stop that maniac for trying to purify the human race, right? So eugenics is about purification of human race. But you can see that the underpinning of this, the philosophical underpinning of this, is a lot of utilitarianism. Is that there are certain races or ethnicities that should not be reproducing, and so we need to eliminate them. That was actually a mentality of the time. There are even quotations of Margaret that are very, very abrasive by today's standard, specifically with regards to the Black population, the Negro population. There is one statement that she made. She was trying to get a little bit ahead of myself. She was a utilitarian by philosophical structure. And basically she fought for women to obtain absolute control over their reproduction. And so she started gathering some funds to try to see how biologically and medically women can control their cycle, all right? And to try to suppress ovulation specifically. So she contracted two fellows, one who was a biologist and a biochemist at Harvard, Gregory Pincus, and he was working on human hormones, especially progestins, the female hormones. And John Rock, who was a very successful OBGYN in Massachusetts and a practicing Catholic, daily communicant, John Rock, all right? And he had a very successful fertility clinic in Massachusetts for women who couldn't conceive. He was able to get them to conceive. At that time, of course, there was very little chemistry known about the whole cycle, and so it was much just on natural means. Margaret got Gregory to work on the progestins, on the estrogen, essentially the synthetic estrogen that would suppress ovulation. And she got John Rock to do the clinical trials, okay? Now at that time, of course, we're back in the 40s, 50s, and the only thing that I would say is that contraception was illegal in the United States, okay? It was coming out of a natural law mentality of the legislatures. And so basically contraception as such, you know, to prevent conception was illegal, okay? And so she had to battle that too. And I'll tell you how that happened kind of a roundabout way, but she needed the clinical data to make her case. At one point, in gathering the funds to do this research, she wrote a letter to the Gamble brothers. You've heard of Procter & Gamble, right? Baby products, okay? Okay, so Gamble were two brothers back then who had already quite a bit of money. Maybe they were millionaires already when a million actually counted. And she wrote a letter, which you can look up on the internet. And she says in part of that letter, requesting the funds for developing the pill, we don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. I mean, it's so abrasive that I've actually memorized it. You can Google it and it will come up. We don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. Because she thought that the Negro population, among other populations, were unfit to reproduce because they were irresponsible, they were lazy. She had a very stereotypical view of races, of certain races, okay? And so certain races in her mind shouldn't reproduce. All right, so you can see the eugenics mentality come through there. At any rate, because it was illegal, contraception in the US in the 50s, then the trials were taken first to Puerto Rico, then eventually to Mexico, and eventually they came back in through the West Coast on migrant workers in California, which were mostly Mexican, but some Asian also. They needed the data to prove this. Now, what happened was in these countries, Haiti also. So in these countries, again, many women were getting pregnant all the time. And so to offer a contraceptive, they were not even told about the placebo. So some were given the placebo without telling them, that there would be a placebo involved in the trial, which is today is highly unethical. Okay. And so women were taking the pill, and some were taking the actual contraceptive pill, and some were given the placebo, but were not told about it. So they were getting pregnant with the pill, but they needed the data. The researchers needed the data to see how many were getting pregnant with the placebo, contrasting, and so forth. But anyway, the women were flocking. They were flocking to get this pill because many of them didn't want to get pregnant. They had enough children already, et cetera, and they wanted a little more control over their lives. And so it spread, the pill really spread like wildfire once it was approved. First, it was approved as a menstrual regulator, and it can do that, yes, okay? But that was really not the intention. It was just used as an excuse to get it approved by the FDA, yes, the FDA was already in place back then, as a menstrual regulator. But then by the 1960s, Margaret was able to get so much support from women about this that eventually the FDA also had to approve it as a contraceptive means, okay? And it's been in place since then. And from the 60s, you can follow the trend, not only here in the United States, but it's spread through many parts of the world, especially more industrialized, industrialized nations where they had access to the pill. And it just goes up in an exponential way, the number of women taking the pill. All right, so to this day, it is the most common contraceptive being used by many people, by many women. And so it happens that on the side of the church, and also John Rock was convinced that the Catholic Church would actually agree on the pill. All right, because why not? It's just the advancement of medicine. It's now a medication that allows women to regulate their cycle and to be able to have their intercourse, their intimacy with their husbands without getting pregnant, all right? And so John Rock, as a practicing Catholic, was convinced that this would be approved by the church, by the Catholic Church. It happened at that time that the Pope at the time was John the 23rd, and John the 23rd was a Pope that wanted to bring the Catholic Church renewal, if you will, and so he convened what is known as a council of the church, of all the bishops of the world, to deal with many, many topics of the church, but basically to bring the church up to date, all right, on many, many topics, including the liturgy and many other issues that had nothing to do with contraception. And so it was known as the Second Vatican Council, which means there was a Vatican Council I that had been almost 100 years prior, in the 1800s, 1860s, was the previous council. There have been a total of 21 of these ecumenical councils in the 2,000 years history of Christianity. And the last one was this one in 1963, the Vatican Council. Actually 62 to 65. I remember I was a little kid back then. At any rate, Pope John the 23rd did not want, this was such a hot topic literally, that he did not want the Second Vatican Council just to be absorbed by this one issue of contraception, because there were many, many other issues on the table, all right? And therefore what he did is he created a commission, a small commission, that would study the issue and would report to him after the council concluded, which was supposed to conclude in 1 or 2 years, something like that. This was the largest council ever in the history of the church. Over 3,000 bishops participated in it in a rotating basis. But then what happened, he opened the council at the beginning of 1963, and toward the end of 1963, he died. So he left the hot potato on the table for others to take care of. So in the midst of that Vatican Council, all right, the Catholic Church also had to go into what is known as a conclave, in other words, to elect a new pope. And the new pope that was elected was Pope Paul VI, And Paul VI, what he did with that commission, he expanded it to 72 members, so much more broad representation, including married men and women and so forth. And so the council, and he brought the council to conclusion in 65. And then the commission gave its report in 66. All right, so a year later, and therefore he was able to rescue, if you will, the Vatican Council so that it did not focus on that single issue. Plus, the main members of the Vatican Council were bishops who, by definition, are celibate, right? So what do they know about pregnancy and marital intimacy and so forth? Therefore, the report of the commission came in a year later, and the council did what it was supposed to do and renew the church, et cetera, et cetera. Many documents came out of there. They were very beautiful documents. At any rate, the majority of the commission approved of the pill, all right, and gave that recommendation of approval. And it is said that Paul VI, something wasn't jiving for him internally about the pill. So he said that he went into very, very deep prayer for some time and finally realized what was the issue. What was the issue, not only philosophical, but an anthropological issue with the pill. And the problem that he discovered is that it creates a radical separation between two dimensions of sexual intercourse that, for it to be human and not just an animal act, all right, needs to have these two dimensions preserved, which we call them the unitive dimension and the procreative dimension. Now, these two dimensions in the act, for it to be truly and fully human, should occur simultaneously, but I'm using very technical language that is synthetic. So what I need to do now is to unpack that a little bit, all right? These two dimensions of human sexual intercourse as human, unitive and procreative. So that's what I'm going to get into now. And a little link here is a reference to the letter itself, the apostolic letter that he wrote. Is called an encyclical. The encyclical typically are written by popes. And like I said, they have consultation from experts on many different fields, but the encyclical is the highest authority in the Catholic Church at the level of a document. So let's go now a little bit into, I want to look a little bit at the anthropology and the psychology, all right, of human sexual intercourse. And what I'm proposing is that first of all, to make some observations, all right, of human sexual intercourse as human. And I'm proposing that it is unique at these three different levels, at the physical level, at the psychological level, and even at the spiritual level. Unique meaning that it separates us from the rest of nature, and particularly from other mammals who are biologically the same as us, but at the level of class, right? So let's start with the physical level, all right? We notice that for other mammals, human sexual intercourse, and for other sexual intercourse, and for other animals, it's all about the progeny. It's all about the progeny, okay? About achieving fertilization. And particularly in mammals, which is known as mounting, It is strictly for reproduction. And physiologically, it's not face-to-face. Okay? Now, without having to go into details, we're all adults here, and you can just use a mental image, but you notice that in other mammals, the mounting is from behind. And just to be clear, that's not anal sex what's going on, okay? It's just that the reproductive organ of the female, when they're quadrupeds, when they're four-legged, you know, basically the trunk is laying horizontally. So the reproductive system is also horizontal, all right? And therefore, it's the normal position for intercourse to occur in mammals. But what I'm trying to say about this is that it's not face-to-face, except for humans. You notice in humans, the normal natural position is face-to-face. And so we're back to the prosopon, the person. It's personal. You follow? There's a personal, it's just by the actual anatomy, is meant to be a personal act. Beginning just with the actual physiology or physical intercourse. So if it engages a person, then we're at a different level. That's number one. Number two, there is also the capacity in the human for women to accept men outside of ovulation, which doesn't occur in nature, all right? For the rest of nature, the female will only accept the male when she's estrous, in other words, when she's ovulating. So you can see that it's strictly for reproduction. It's just business, all right? And I give a simple example. If a lion tries to mount a lioness outside of estrus, she would just turn around and rip him apart and kill the lion. Done. However, so what does the lion do? The lion knows that. So the lion will keep a distance and will be smelling and tracking her urine until that estrogen level rises on the urine, okay, on her urine. And then he will approach. And as he approaches, that lioness will lay down nice and quietly and assume the position, rear her end, and allow herself to be mounted for, you know, a split second, maybe a few seconds. I don't think it reaches a minute. And it's done. And then he better walk away. So you see that it's strictly for reproduction, and it's all hormonal driven, so that it's instinctive, and it's not personal. The lion couldn't care less which lioness he mounts, as long as she allows herself to be mounted. You know, it can be anyone from the harem. The same, and since mammals typically are herd animals, right? What is the typical situation for mammals? Generally, the herd is a harem. In other words, there's the alpha male, and we'll have his females, and then there will be other beta males trying to compete until the alpha male gets either injured or old or whatever, and will be replaced. So it's a dynamic system there, but you can see that the whole issue about the herd and the harem is so that some female is always pregnant at some point, and therefore, again, it's reproductive success. It's trying to edge favor toward the reproduction, all right, toward the progeny. Okay, all right. So what I'm trying to say by all this is that it's very much driven by instinct, hormones, and they're kind of locked into that. Non-personal is the furthest away you can get from a personal relationship. Very different from the human, right? Because when consider that that intimacy is the most intense intimacy in general that a person can have, to the point of the physical intimacy, right? Now we have many relationships with many people at the level of family and friends and so forth, okay? But normal human beings don't go around having that physical intimacy with their family or friends on a regular basis. It's typically reserved because it's very intense, okay? And that's where we go from the physiological to the psychological, the fact that it's not just two bodies that are engaged in this, but also two hearts, two minds, okay? And that, again, reinforces the whole issue that it's a personal relationship. So when we look at that, the best situation, the best scenario is for that relationship to be a long-term relationship, precisely because the investment, and I'm talking about now psychological investment, emotional investment into that relationship, okay, And a lot of it is the burden falls on the woman. Because when you think about it, in principle, one can say that the woman is investing more into the sexual intimacy than the man. Again, he is not getting pregnant, all right? And so for him, that intercourse may be just a few minutes or whatever, half an hour, whatever you want to do it. But for the woman, it may be 9 months plus raising a child, 20 years. If they're Hispanic, maybe 30, 40 years, because the kid doesn't want to get out of the home until they marry. And so, you know, it's a long-term commitment. And they know that. The women know that, and therefore there's more investment, there's more at risk there, okay? All right, so this mutual lifelong commitment is the best scenario. Therefore, I'm appealing here to what could otherwise be termed as the fidelity in the marriage, okay, in the relationship. Now consider this, there's also human, just secular values inserted here before we appeal to anything spiritual or religious or the faith, just at the human secular level of a faithful relationship between a man and a woman. One can make the case that when there's an infidelity, again, just at the human level, when he's cheating on her and she's cheating on him, on a third party, in other words, where there's that intimacy with a third party, how does the cheated person feel? Just humanly, they don't have to be religious people. They feel very hurt, okay? They feel betrayed, deeply betrayed. So that's pointing out to the fact that, in fact, this intimacy is a very special type of intimacy, all right? And should be exclusive, an exclusive intimacy between a man and a woman. The reason for man and woman is because of the other dimension also, right? Of not only the complementarity of the attraction, what we know as heterosexuality, but also the whole issue of the possibility of procreation. Anyway, I want to make the case that this intimacy is not just at the physiological level, but because we are human and not just animals, right? We don't just go by instinct. There's also minimally a psychological dimension and even a spiritual dimension involved here, without having to be religious necessarily, but spiritual. So that forming a life project together, okay? A life project together. And so that spiritual intimacy then can translate into two hearts coming together. So not just two naked bodies, but also two naked hearts. In other words, when they open to each other, things about their life, about their intimate life, good and bad, right? We don't do that at the beginning just with an acquaintance. We don't tell them our deep joys and sorrows to just a casual acquaintance. We reserve that for special people. And so that spouse, that partner should be that most special people with whom we reveal very intimate things that have nothing to do with sexuality necessarily, just intimate. And so there's a spiritual bonding that also happens, okay? And it's natural, it's the way it's supposed to be because, again, of the hylomorphism of the substantial union of body and soul. All right. The next layer could be, again, drawing from psychology and a normal heterosexual relationship, that relationship is generous, it's love-giving, all right? And also can be life-giving, so that the couple, under normal circumstances, assuming that they're both fertile, can generate children. And so there's a tangible product. And again, most normal couples feel joy at having their children under normal circumstances, okay? So it's also life-giving. It's love-giving and life-giving, and that would be the procreative dimension. There's a normal, natural flow there, okay? I'm still at the level of principle. I don't mean that the couple has to have a child every 9 months or 9.5 months to give her 2 weeks to recover. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that in principle, this generous love also can be projected toward the generation of a third party who is a product of the two of them, which is the children. So, and that's why we talk about the fact that we don't reproduce as animals do instinctively, but we procreate. And introducing this language also gives us an advantage. Remember the euphemisms, and it's all about how we use the terms and what we mean by the terms. When we talk about procreation, we have introduced now an element here of a creative activity, all right? Which again, animals are not capable of doing because it's not in their nature. But we have this procreative activity, which one way or another flows also from the will. Oh, that's the other aspect which I forgot to mention at the beginning, which the woman, yes, with the example with the lion, where I was trying to get there with the lion, the lioness, is that unlike female mammals, women are indeed capable of accepting the man outside of ovulation, outside of the fertile time, which, by the way, is when normally the estrogen is a little higher, so there's a natural greater desire there, okay? That's just the natural level. What I'm saying is because of the human will, the woman can indeed accept the man outside of her time of ovulation, which is in radical contrast with the rest of mammals and the rest of animals that reproduce sexually, right? Of course, the man, the cycles are different, we know that, and therefore, because the man is producing testosterone basically since puberty, then the desire, the natural normal desire is there all the time until basically we hit the grave. Mm-hmm. And any man who denies that he has a natural orientation and desire for intimacy, in my opinion, is not being truthful. Now, the intensity may vary from person to person and so forth, but if the testosterone is there, then the desire is naturally going to be there if all the receptors are working fine, right? So the will is very important, precisely so that we don't end up behaving like instinctive animals on both parts, the part of the man and the woman. And it's another way of saying or introducing this aspect that intimacy is personal because the human will is engaged, right? Now, with contraception, how can we look at contraception a little bit more on the psychological aspect is the intention to avoid children with artificial means. You notice that I put it at the level of intention. Again, the will. Okay, so I want to take it to that psychological level. Of course, the means that are used are physical means, either mechanical or chemical or surgical, which we'll see in a minute. But basically, it's that desire, that intention to avoid children with some artificial means. And I'm introducing also this thing with artificial means because I will give one lecture on natural family planning, which is the desire to avoid children through natural means. In other words, using the infertile type of the woman's cycle. Now, again, I have to crunch a little bit to make this a single lecture, but basically for human sexual intercourse to really truly and fully human, it would be open not only to the generosity of the spouses, of their mutual sharing of their lives, the life project together, but being open to having children, right? And that would be like the natural, the default stance, if you will, is a desire for having children. However, for serious or important reasons, children may well be avoided at that particular time in the couple's marriage. And serious reasons can be many, all right? The typical serious reason is financial, but it doesn't have to be financial. It may be just a time issue. For example, they're both in medical school and there's no time to raise children at that time because they have to drink out of the fire hose, as they say, of all the medical school stuff, right? And so there's no time. Or it could be a health issue. They may have the money, but not the health. Or maybe it's relocation. The average family, I read one time, long time ago, that the average American family moves, you know, how often? Approximately, I'll take a guess, every how often? It's in terms of years, but 10. Yeah, I saw about 6 years on average. Every 6 years, family uproots into another town altogether, city, state. Now it may be even shorter than that. And the main thing is the job, right? There's a better job, but it's not here, it's over there. So honey, let's go. It's challenging, right? One has to uproot, especially the kids in school and all that. But there are serious reasons. What I'm trying to say is that there are many serious reasons for avoiding children at that particular time. But it also, because it involves the will and the conscience, it also involves honesty. They have to be honest about this and not really be using finances, for example, as an excuse for not having children, because they want to have another trip to Europe or they want to have the latest car every year. You know, then the priorities are kind of backwards, okay? So the couple has to be very, very honest with themselves when they do this, dialogue about how many children to have and when to have the children and so forth. I can also tell you that what is happening in the population in general, it's a good thing that can be very challenging for when women are studying careers now, which I fully support for women to study careers, right? But then what happens? They're studying careers in their early 20s, and now you sweated blood, sweat, and tears to get a bachelor's, and now you want to apply that bachelor and get a job and get a little better job. And if you do a master's, even more so, you want to now apply that into the workforce and become a professional. But then that engages the woman, you know, on a full-time job, et cetera, with all the demands there. And it's more difficult to raise the child. So a number of women, especially in the professional fields, are postponing childbearing until their 30s. But what happens? Remember, God always forgives if there's repentance. Man sometimes forgives, sometimes we forgive, sometimes we hold grudges, sometimes we don't forgive. Nature never forgives, and the clock keeps ticking. So by the time the woman gets between 32 to 35, what happens? Aneuploidy. The chromosomes start sticking after meiosis 1, arrested at birth. Baby girl has millions of eggs in meiosis 1 arrested, and she needs to hit puberty a dozen years later until meiosis 2 kicks in and she's actually ovulating. But if aneuploidy occurs, chromosomal abnormality, they stick together, and the typical one is trisomy 21, which is the smallest chromosome actually. 22 is just that when they were numbering them, some technician got confused and saw that 22 was smaller than 21, so 22 got numbered then, but actually when you look at them in karyotypes, right, 22 is slightly larger than 21, so they should be around. Anyway, the point is that 21 is one of the smallest chromosomes, and it also happens to have some of the smallest load, genetic load, meaning genes, and therefore the genes that are there, if there's an extra load, as in trisomy, right, one extra load, typically it's compatible with life. It's trisomy 21, as you know, and there are some characteristics. It's a syndrome, also known as Down syndrome, right? Because Dr. Down, or Mr. Actually, it was who was it that discovered Down syndrome? He was very pro-life, and he was extremely saddened to see that his discovery was being used to euthanize Down syndrome children, babies in the womb. He'll come to me. He's a Frenchman. Anyway, Down syndrome, as you know, syndrome means it's a cluster of symptoms and signs and symptoms. And so it's at the physiological level and at the psychological level, right? From the most mild to the most severe physiologically, and also from the most mild to the most severe psychologically, and any combination of those two. So they generally die younger, but they can be, I have a Down syndrome second cousin, Elisa, and she's now in high school, and she's fully mainstream with all the other kids in high school, all right? She must be about 16 or 17 now. She loves dancing, and she's just the joy of the family. She always gets the attention of everybody. They have a special, I don't know what they're called, mentor or someone, or There's an adult that is always with them because they can get into trouble. They're very innocent and they're spontaneous and they don't know how to distinguish good from evil sometimes. And so they need monitoring. But academically, they're mainstream, and it can be mainstream. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that postponing childbearing for women is much more dangerous or challenging than for men, okay? Precisely because of the difference in the cycling and the fact that the eggs simply get old. They get physically old. And the best years, therefore, the best reproductive years really are in the 20s on average for women. And that's a big challenge. And that's why I truly consider it's more challenging for women to study a career than for men, all right? It's just a reality. All right. Going forward, let's look a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because this is more on the clinical, biological, clinical side of things. Basically, 3 types of contraception: mechanical, chemical, or surgical, and actually some combinations of those. One that is a combination is the IUD, for example, that has actual progestin on the tips. So it's not only touching the IUD. It's not exactly known to this day what is the precise mechanism, contraceptive mechanism, but it's considered that it's because it's touching the endometrium, it's touching the inner lining of the uterus, and the uterus is kind of fooled into thinking that it's pregnant, and so it suppresses ovulation. However, there is breakthrough ovulation, and that's why I have these 3 as possible abortifacients also, possible, statistically, all right? Because either with the pill or with the IUD or with what is known as the morning after pill, which is just a mega dose of the estrogen, basically in 1 or 2, this is a 2-dose thing, right? She takes 1 immediately after, that's why it's morning after the intercourse, hoping that there hasn't been any pregnancy yet to suppress ovulation. Because sperm, so normally an egg lasts how long in the endometrium for fertilization? The normal window, 24 hours, okay, of maturity. After 24 hours, on average, if the egg is not matured, it over-ripens like a fruit that matures very fast and rottens, and then it has to be discarded, and that's menstruation. The sperm, on average, lasts mature for 24 hours. In the testicles, okay? In the vas deferens, wherever the seminiferous vesicles, 24 hours. After that, it dies and it's reabsorbed by the tissue. That's why we don't blow up, because we're making sperm all the time. And there's a dynamic system there that on average, we make as much sperm as the sperm that's getting old, and the old sperm is just proteases, digested, and it's reabsorbed by the walls, the internal walls of the tubes. At any rate, sperm also lasts within the male tract about 24 hours, but inside the female reproductive tract, it may last up to 5 days because the sperm receives from the mucus, from the cervical mucus, nutrition, all right? So the cervical mucus is very interesting. It serves as a lubricant, as a nutrient for sperm, and also as a bactericide, as a germicide, changes the pH and so forth, to keep bacteria out. All right, anyway, what happens is that there is something known as breakthrough ovulation, and we can see that on the statistics. Most of these methods claim 97 to 99%. When you read the little pamphlets, all right? Let's say the pill that on average is the most effective one, it could be 99, let's say 99.9%. What does that mean statistically? If it's 99%, it means that 1 out of 100 women who are taking the pill every day will get pregnant, statistically, taking the pill, all right? If it's 99.9%, then it means that 1 out of 1,000 women taking the pill every day will get pregnant, having intercourse, of course. All right, when you bump that up to 200 with 230 million in the United States, half of that is women, right? So 160, but not all are adults, etc. But it's quite a few 100 million. Okay, so And so what I'm saying is that this statistic is not insignificant. And there's no means that is going to be 100%. The only means that is 100% effective of avoiding children is not having intercourse. Period. That's the only one. Every other mean is going to have some percentage, very high, but not 100%. What does that mean? That means that there is breakthrough ovulation, which is known, all right? In other words, that in spite of the high dosage or the cycling of the estrogen and so forth, the ovaries still, a follicle still breaks through, matures and ovulates in spite of the hormonal signal that it's getting. Because nature is very stubborn and it's hardwired to do that. So sometimes it manages to override the synthetic hormonal signal that it's receiving. All right, risks and side effects you can read about. The point is that because there is breakthrough ovulation, and if there's intercourse during that breakthrough ovulation, then there's going to be fertilization, conception. But it's also known that either the pill or the IUD also renders, as a secondary effect, renders the endometrium inhospitable for implantation. It thins it out, okay, as a secondary effect. So what happens? If there is breakthrough ovulation and fertilization, and now the early embryo is traveling through the tube, coming toward the endometrium, how long? 5 to 7 days, right? 1 week. A week later, that little blastocyst arrives at the endometrium and finds the endometrium inhospitable. So the early embryo is discarded, you see? And you can say, well, that's a spontaneous abortion. But it's not a spontaneous abortion. Number one, that embryo may not have any genetic defect. Number two, that discarding did not come natural in the sense that it was triggered by either the pill or the IUD. So had the pill or the IUD not been there and the blastocyst arrived to its place of the endometrium, would have found a hospitable endometrium, a spongy endometrium, which is part of the natural hormonal signaling of the corpus luteum and all that. Follow? So bottom line is that there is some abortifacient effect of these methods. And I'm saying this because where some women or some couples may be okay with contraception, they may not be okay with abortion. But they may not be realizing that they are having abortions because it's a very early pregnancy loss. And again, she may just think that she's having a late period, but inside that flow, blood flow, there's a little tiny microscopic blastocyst, not over-ripened egg. Okay, let's move forward now I have to round back into the bioethical or the moral evaluation for contraception. Basically, bottom line is that what contraception does, artificial contraception, it separates radically the unitive from the procreative dimension. What I had talked about earlier, that in principle they should be together to make that act truly a human personal act of intimacy of body and soul. With contraception, the couple can have the unitive, in other words, the bonding and all that, but eliminating the procreative dimension. But that putting aside or blocking the procreative dimension is being done artificially, you follow, with some artifact being introduced, either a mechanical or a chemical or a surgical artifact. Okay? By the way, on surgical, I just wanted to mention briefly, again, going back a little bit on the psychology of things, that, where did I have it? Here. So for surgical sterilization, for non-therapeutic sterilization, we know that it is the vasectomy for men, the tubal ligation for women. And I just put hysterectomy there as a reference that, of course, normal in civilized society, medicine does not use a hysterectomy as a contraceptive means, okay? But it's a side effect. So I don't include it there because it has, if a hysterectomy is done for removing a tumor or something like that for therapeutic reasons, it does cause sterility as a consequence. At any rate, in principle, tubal ligations and vasectomies are reversible in principle, in theory, but in practice, it's not so easy. Okay, first of all, there's a fiscal consideration because these are elective surgeries. Sometimes insurance doesn't cover it. And so it's several $1,000s that the couple has to pay out of pocket a second time after doing the ligation, all right? And now to reverse it, it's several other $1,000s, aside from the discomfort and the hospitalization and all that. But also, what happens psychologically is many couples decide, they say, well, we'll have children later, so we'll do the sterilization now. When they revisit the issue, they're just comfortable with that other lifestyle and don't reverse it. Also, there are some clinical issues that need to be considered because typically tying the tubes, right before they tie the tubes, they cut the tubes, whether it's the male or the female, they cut it and then they either tie them together or they try to cauterize, whatever. For reestablishing the connection, it's a process called anastomosis, which the tubes have to be sewed back together in almost microsurgery, mini surgery, all right? The tube has to be anastomosed, has to be sewed back together. And so you can imagine in that sewing, scarring may occur, but not so much on the outside, but on the inside of the tube. And if scarring occurs on the inside of the tube, in other words, there's some fibers that accumulate there, that can cause a block of the embryo of the blastocyst, because the blastocyst is about 10 microns, microscopic, gets stuck on that little scar, and that could lead to ectopic pregnancy. Dangerous for the woman, and therefore it has to be noted that a tubal ligation is more dangerous for the woman than a vasectomy for the man. So again, the burden on the woman. The woman is taking the pill, the woman is risking getting blood clots, et cetera, you know, or the IUD. The burden typically is on the woman, all right? So in my mind, it's also an issue of fairness. How about leveling the playing field? Where the man has as much responsibility as the woman for avoiding the children or making that decision truly between the two of them. All right, so you can see the couple can have the unitive without the procreative with artificial contraception, but even the unitive could also be truncated. What I'm calling a pseudo-unitive, because there's a psychological, well, I have a slide on that. Let me hold off on that thought for a moment. But this radical separation, you know, do we have a right to do that for an act that is human, that is one of the most human acts that we can consider, that distinguishes us from the rest of nature? You know, do we really have a right to separate these two dimensions that were meant to be together? I used a little simple analogy of a coin. You can imagine there are so many different coins in the world, right? So many different coins. And even within a nation, there are various coins for that particular nation. We have a penny, a nickel, a dime, there's a half dollar, there's a full dollar, there's a silver dollar, et cetera, et cetera. Regardless of the coin, all coins have one common characteristic. They all have two sides. They'll have two sides, regardless of the shape of the coin. The form of the coin is that they have two sides, right? Now we can separate the two sides of the coin, heads or tails. We take a laser beam and we split that nickel down the middle, but we're really doing violence to that coin. We're destroying the nature of the coin. So this is a simple analogy that I use when we separate radically the unitive from the procreative dimension. We're doing ontological violence to that act that is meant to be together, all right? To be truly human. Again, I'm not saying that the couple needs to have a child every 9 months, because I already mentioned that for serious reasons, a couple may avoid children even indefinitely. But they have to revisit that and make it of mutual accord. of mutual accord. That to me is really leveling the playing field, that they together decide when to have children and how many to have. And they're both on the same page with it, okay? Control, yes, that's another aspect of the pill, that it allows this control, but it is an artificial control. It's a control that comes at a price. And typically, the woman is paying the much higher price than the man. Therefore, there is an injustice that is inserted with this artificiality. How about we try to level the playing field? These are some of the dynamics that I believe are unfair with artificial contraception. Beginning with the libido, which is just a psychological term for sexual desire. It's different, whereas the man, on average, man, once he's reached teenage years of puberty, in principle, because we're producing testosterone all the time, the desire, the natural desire is there. The woman is cycling. So the desire for her is not always there. Generally, it's more when she's ovulating because there's a peak, there's an estrogen peak, all right? And so to demand, for the man to demand for the woman to be available all the time is disrespectful of her cycling. You know, he's only being concerned about his desire. Whereas there's a time when the woman desires it, and there's a time when she doesn't desire it or desire it less. And so there's a libido, what I'm calling a libido differential. With contraception, you can think of the dynamics. The man, the husband or boyfriend is saying, well, you're on the pill or we're using contraception, so why are you not giving yourself to me? Don't you love me? So it puts a pressure on her to give herself even when she may not want to. See, because he wants to. And so what's the excuse? Don't you love me? You follow? There's an unfairness inserted that sometimes it happens subconsciously. It just comes in. And it can also turn human sexual intercourse into a type of entertainment. It makes it easy. It makes it cheap. In other words, shall we go to the movies tonight or shall we have sex, you know? It kind of cheapens it. It doesn't make it something really special as it should be, all right? Considering really what's at stake. Typically, the burdens on the woman, I talked about earlier already. When we project these psychological issues to the social level, at the social level, it can and it does, and it has over decades now, generated a contraceptive mentality. What do I mean by contraceptive mentality? Contraceptive mentality is that the default is to avoid children. In other words, have a child by exception, you know, but you really have to justify having a child. I've known of couples, they've told me, Father, we have a third child, and people are looking at us funny. They're saying things to us, you know, how dare you bring another child into this world? And it's happening. At the social level, this is creating a lot of problems. You keep hearing me saying, not a week goes by without a bioethical issue hitting the news, the secular news. You can't get more secular than the BBC, all right? Just last week, there was another article on, it's already known, this negative population growth, where a number of countries, the more evolved countries, the more industrialized countries are going into negative population growth. Did I already talk about that? I forget what class I talked to about. All right, negative population growth. That's the other course that I'm teaching. It means that there are fewer births than deaths. Okay, in other words, people, precisely with the good practice of medicine, we're living longer, but we're not having enough children coming in to replace those who are dying. And so what's happening is that the population is aging in general, becoming more, and they're going more into retirement. And so Social Security, who's paying into that? Because it's the working force that produces the taxes that pays for the Social Security of the retired. And if we don't have enough young people going or younger people going into the workforce to earn money so that they can pay taxes on the earnings, then there's not enough coming in for maintaining the retirement of retired people, the Social Security. And that's causing a problem, which is an economic problem. In Europe, for quite a few years now, to the point that governments are actually paying couples to have children, and they don't want to have children. Very challenging. Couples are actually, Belgium, France, a number of countries pay couples to have children because many couples no longer want to have children, all right? China? Yeah, well, China is even more drastic because of the one child policy. That's kind of the opposite. One child, the China is actually restricting the government, the hierarchy there, the oligarchy is restricting the number of children they can have. Another horrible injustice. So what happens? If the couple can only have one child, most couples, their first child, they want it to be boy or girl? Boy. Boy. Most couples want their first born to be a boy. Why? Well, even if we're going to have other children, you know, we have girls later, at least the older will be a boy and he'll be able to defend his sisters, okay? So there's a natural, most couples just naturally want their firstborn to be a boy. And therefore, in China, and also in more traditional societies and cultures, it takes more effort and more expense to raise a child, to raise a woman, to raise a girl, right? She can cause more problems. She can get pregnant as a teenager. Some cultures actually have to pay for the girl to marry. The dowry, she has to pay to the man to marry because she's going to cost more. You know, she's not going to go out and work as much as the man and so forth. So in some cultures, the more traditional cultures, happens some in Latin America, mostly Africa, Asia, it's considered more of a burden to raise a girl than to raise a boy, okay? Less strong, can work less, all kinds of things are there. And so if the government is telling you can only have one child, then they want to have a boy. And of course, abortion is legal, and even forced abortion in some parts of China, some provinces. If the woman is having a second child, they'll actually take her to the abortion clinic. The government will take her to the abortion clinic, all right? I mean, it's just drastic. What happens is that has skewed the population, right? To have more men than women. And they've had that policy for so long now that they're now more adult men than women. And so there are fewer women to go around, literally. And so the men are competing and they're fighting. They're actually getting to fist fights in factories and large places where there are more men than women. They fight for the women, okay, in actual physical fights. And it's causing a whole social upheaval in China. And so the Chinese government has realized that this is a mistake, this policy, and they're beginning to relax that policy in certain regions, but mostly in the rural areas. The urban areas are still very restrictive. They do other crazy things like restrict people from traveling from one town to another. And they're obsessed about the imaging, the facial recognition thing, the cameras all over the place. It's crazy. It's crazy because the government is trying to macromanage the population, right? Very, very challenging. But we in the open societies, what is known as open societies over here in the West, Europe, North America, we're no better with this thing because it's actually now causing negative population growth. Would you believe that Pope Paul VI, in that encyclical of 1968, mentioned these things? He mentioned the rate of infidelity will skyrocket, and in fact, divorce has skyrocketed, and the main reason for divorce is an infidelity, which they say, well, because there's no evidence, all right? Contraception makes infidelity easy because there's no consequence. Yeah, there's no child, but there's definitely consequence at the level of the relationship. Anyway, I think you get the gist for where I'm coming from with regards to contraception. All of the negative consequences because of that artificiality introduced into that intimate relationship. To finish, STDs are going skyrocket. It's become epidemic now, STDs in the United States. They're epidemic, okay? You can look it up. This is from the CDC. This was 2017. So the total cases of the four highest STDs, chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, and syphilis, over 2 million, right, in the United States. At that time, we were 325 million. So if we round these numbers up, It means that 1 in every 160 Americans. This includes children also, because the 325 is the whole population. It includes children and the third age, the elderly. 1 in every 160 American has an STD. Had an STD. This is 2017. This morning I got curious, said, wow, this is a 4-year-old statistic. Let's update it. So I looked at this, the CDC website. They're behind by 2 years. So the latest numbers are from 2019. So it's a 2-year update. And all the ticks are up except HIV. Thanks to God, at least one has gone down. Happened to be the smallest one in numbers, but look at the, so I put the new numbers here for 2019, 1,000,008 for chlamydia. So that was an increase from 2017 of 100,000. For gonorrhea, from 550 something to 600 something. So it's an increase of 60,000 just in 2 years, all right? This is in absolute numbers. I mentioned HIV has gone down actually in 2 years by 600 cases. Out of 37, it's 600 less than that. Syphilis, on the other hand, went from about 38 or 39,000, what was it? No, 31,000 to 129, almost 100,000 increase in syphilis in 2 years. Clinicians, STDs have become epidemic in the United States. One of the main reasons is because of the cheapening, of intercourse, truly, which has made it that way because of the availability of contraception. And the pill doesn't avoid any of this, right? The condoms maybe, but even once one of the most famous, one of the most popular brands of condom is Trojan. I was doing some research one time. See, let me see the porosity of, because it's a latex, right? It's some kind of a rubber. Anyway, it's not totally solid down to the atomic level or molecular level. So I want to see what is the porosity of a condom. And I called Trojan, and they said, oh, that's classified information. That's proprietary, not proprietary information. What does that tell you? It may be able to stop a sperm, but it may not be able to stop a virus from going through, right? Okay, anyway, another argument, final, I promise, is we can look at it from the medical perspective. Now, you consider what is the first principle of medicine? First, do no harm, which is translated as healing, right? Medicine is the act of healing, which actually goes against natural selection. We're the only animal that practices medicine, which means enabling the weaker, at least to reproductive success or to reproductive age. Whether they actually succeed or not, it's a different story. But medicine in general enables the weaker, and therefore it goes against natural selection. And yet we should practice medicine. Why should we practice medicine if it goes against natural selection? We can make the argument that it's weakening the human population, the human species. First of all, not everyone has, sadly, not everyone has the access to medicine. Many millions of people in the world, billions of people don't have access to medicine. So it's not going to weaken the species significantly, right? When the people who have least access to medicine are also the ones who are procreating most. But even hypothetically, even theoretically, we should still practice medicine. Even if it weakens the population, let's say, or the species, because of a higher value, which is benevolence. Again, the will, bene volere, benevolence means that we can will the good. Bene is good, volere is to will. We can will the good. And then beneficence. Bene facere, we can do the good. We can will the good and we can do the good, and therefore we should do the good. It's an ethical imperative, if you will. We can will the good of other people. You know, a person is ill, we can heal them, we have medication for it, and then we should do it. Therefore, we should do it. If we can do the good, then we should do the good. All right? Anyway, you think of contraception, what does it do physiologically? It's rendering a healthy person infertile, whether it's the man or the woman. So it's the only type of medical practice that it's actually rendering a healthy organ infertile, rendering that organ going against the natural function of that organ. And I cannot think of another case in medicine where an organ is being hampered from doing its natural function. Okay, so really at the end of the day, it's a type of mutilation, whether it's chemical, mechanical, or surgical. So we can say that it's bad medical practice, especially since there is an alternative that is natural and healthy. Now, if there was no alternative, okay, we could make an argument maybe for contraception. But the fact that there is a natural, normal, healthy alternative to artificial contraception, I think that one can make the case that the practice of contraception is bad medical practice. It's rendering healthy organs inoperative. All right. Okay, we've gone beyond the hour and a half, so I'm going to stop here. We'll look at the double effect within the context of ectopic pregnancy in a later lecture. So I think it's a good spot to stop. Again, another heavy topic, difficult. I think I'm inviting you to reflect a little bit on it, all right? And look at the slides again. Go over the video if you wish. Any comments or questions anyone wants to make? I know it's delicate, but you know, that's the nature of bioethics. We're going to go from one delicate topic to another here to the bitter end, all right? So hang in there. All right, thanks again. And if there's nothing, then I'll see you next Friday, 2 o'clock, same place, same time. All right, thanks again. I'm gonna close up then. Let's stop the recording here, stop share, and okay. Bye, Liza.
Bye.
Okay.